Welcome guys, Wes DIY Food Plot Pro, thanks for joining us. A lot of us have target deer right now that are either missing, haven't shown up in a pretty good while, that we would really like to know where are they at, where have they gone, are they still alive, have they been harvested by another hunter. When a buck goes missing, especially when we're in a dry year such as this, we all have that faint idea in the back of our mind like, oh gosh, I hope blue tongue didn't get him. So blue tongue is a disease, or EHD is a disease that whitetails get from drinking stagnant warm water, especially in dry years where those puddles are smaller, congregates the whitetails more. Essentially the whitetail drinks that midge or no-see-ums, basically gets infected, and essentially what happens is the blood vessels get messed up and he starts basically bleeding. That deer will start running a really high fever and he's gonna go to water. Obviously he's overheated, so he thinks water's cooling him down. That's why we find a lot of the whitetails around a water source that end up dying from blue tongue. I was looking at a new piece of property the other day and I came up on just an absolute giant. He was either a 9 or a 10 pointer, depending on if you count the little sticker or not. Heavy mass, just a good solid mature whitetail, and the carcass was there. I picked the rack up, I've got it cleaned up, cleaning it up right now, and I went back to look at those feet, because when we find a dead deer this time of the year, especially after the gun season or bow season opens, we start thinking, well, a lot of these deer somebody made a bad shot, never did find this buck, and he was wounded. And that was what first thing that crossed my mind. Our bow season's been in for about a month here, and I just thought, well, somebody made a bad shot. I decided to go back and investigate a little bit to really nail down the cause of what's causing some of these big mature bucks to disappear. When I got to the farm yesterday and I started looking around, I quickly found all 4 hoofs. The first hoof I found was perfectly fine. It was normal. There was no abnormalities in the hoof, so I'm thinking, okay, this is not blue tongue. This is what I suspected, maybe a bad shot. Maybe for some reason the deer got weak and coyotes were able to get it down. So I nearly drove off. Well, then I saw the other hoofs there. So I thought, well, I'm gonna go over and take a peek at them. And 3 out of the 4 were very bad cracked. One had actually basically had fallen off. Another one was maybe an inch shorter than what the other hoof was supposed to be. So definitely having a lot of hoof issues on that animal. That's classic blue tongue. So when I saw that, I knew instantly that that deer had got blue tongue. He was found near a creek, but he wasn't in a creek. He was up on a bank within 50 feet of being inside the actual creek. We have been terribly dry here in Western Kentucky, and that makes this disease worse. It congregates all the deer to all those places. So what do we know about EHD and blue tongue, about the outbreaks? And from what the information that I've been able to gather, about typically every 1 out of every 10 years you can have a big outbreak. Typically, even on the big outbreak years, it's less than 25% of your herd, which is a ridiculous amount. If you think of if it ever gets up to 25%, you've got 1 out of every 4 that's dying, and that's a ton of deer that are going down to that disease. But typically they claim that it's just a few cases. Here's what blows my mind about this. I know this buck, seen him before on camera. I knew of him. He lived in a very small area all summer long, and this is the mind-boggling part. This deer lived right in the area of a natural spring that runs 24/7, 365. It never shuts off. Doesn't really fit the bill with like a nasty old cattle pond with real muddy banks that are real, slow sloped into the water where midges are. That's perfect breeding ground for them. This deer did not fit that bill. There was really no ponds right in that area. He should have had clean drinking water year round that was midge free. So that's one thing that was a little bit surprising about that area. But another thing that gave the EHD away was the time of year, and that's typically going to be worse from August to September is when that's going to be worse. And I found him in October is when I found him. He'd been dead a couple weeks. He likely died at the end of September. Now the real good news pertaining EHD outbreaks in our area. We know that drought makes them a lot worse. We know prolonged dry periods makes this a whole lot worse. But the good news about this is the cold front that we've got coming from the north here the next couple days. It's October 25th or 26th here, I believe. We've got a big cold front coming the next few days, and we are going to have our first freeze here. As soon as you get the freeze, the EHD outbreak should pretty much vanish at that point. That freeze will kill those bugs, so the outbreak should stop. One really important note to mention is EHD is not fatal to all whitetails. Some whitetails will survive EHD. Matter of fact, I saw this with my own eyes. I wished I had a picture to show you guys. It was amazing to see. We had a hunter out. He killed what I would consider probably a 4-year-old 10-pointer. Good deer, solid mass, just a deer that most of us would shoot if we saw in the wild. But when we got up to the deer looked like a 1.5-year-old doe. It was really odd looking, and this was in the December muzzleloader hunt. So this was well after the EHD outbreak should have been over with, that a hunter killed this deer. We never did weigh that deer, but there's no way that deer weighed 120 pounds. Where a typical mature whitetail in our area is going to weigh somewhere between 190 and 230 pounds. It's going to be in that range. That's a mature buck is what this was, probably a 4-year-old deer. When we got to him and we were like, golly, look at the freaking rat, look at the body on this deer. This thing is tiny, little bitty dude. What the crap's going on with this? When we got him back to the lodge, there was a guy that extremely knowledgeable about him. And as soon as he saw that deer, he said, I bet you that's blue tongue. Check his hoof. Well, we did, and sure enough, the hooves were cracked. They were messed up. They were shorter. Some were shorter than others. That's all classic sign of blue tongue. You see a buck that's limping around and you harvest that deer and you look at those hoofs. Oftentimes an EHD survivor will have real cracked and messed up hooves, as did that deer that we killed that year. We had an absolute giant in 2021. His body was tiny. It was midsummer. I would say the deer was somewhere in the 160 to 170 range. Just an absolute brute. Looking at his body, you thought 2-year-old deer. No way in the world that that's a 2-year-old deer here in my neck of the woods. Now maybe out in Iowa, some of them other places, northern Illinois, maybe it's not going to happen here. That's not a 2-year-old deer. You're not going to get 170 inches of growth in 2 years here. That was a whole train of thought. We're like, oh my God, this is a absolute mega giant like you see on TV. He's 170 inches as a 2-year-old. As a 3-year-old, this deer is going to be over 200 inches, no question about it. So he got passed on. Nobody killed him. As we pull the cameras for 2022, I'm soaking the cameras in that area where he shows up, because I know he's a freaking giant last year. I want to see what he did this year. He lost 15 to 20 inches of antler growth. The guy that killed him said he scored 153 the next year. I would have very much liked to have looked at that deer's hoofs and seen if he had cracked hoofs. I fully suspect that deer had blue tongue and was able to survive it. That's the only thing that makes sense in my mind to why you have a 170-inch 2-year-old. The deer really wasn't 2-year-old, is my mind. In my mind, that deer's likely a 4 or a 5-year-old. He got sick from blue tongue. He lost all his body weight. He was able to survive our mild winter. He came back, but not as healthy as he was the year before. Eventually was able to beat it, but suffered antler loss the next year following. Something to think about a little bit. Thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. Smash that like and subscribe button.